Wars. A Grail-inspired clarification for mankind. Preface. War is one of the greatest stains on humanity's history, yet it remains one of the least understood phenomena of earthly existence. Modern man imagines war to be a political, economic, territorial, or cultural struggle. He believes it to arise from leaders, governments, armies, nations, and ideologies. But all these are only the final earthly expressions of a much deeper spiritual reality. This book seeks to shine the light of the Grail message upon the subject of war, not to condemn humanity, but to clarify, awaken, warn, and guide. For the lack of true spiritual knowledge has darkened human understanding to the point where war is now considered normal, inevitable, or part of human nature. Such false views imprison the soul and cloud humanity's destiny. War is neither normal nor natural. It is the product of spiritual derailment. This book is for those who want to understand what war truly is. Those trapped in war, internally or externally, who seek a genuine way out. Those who desire to live in harmony with the laws of creation and avoid the coming harvest of their wrong sowings. Humanity at large, which must awaken if it desires peace instead of destruction. The knowledge contained herein is not an intellectual debate, a political theory, or a philosophical speculation. It is the exposure of the true spiritual processes that give rise to every conflict, whether between nations, groups, families, or individuals. War is not merely something that happens out there. It begins within the human spirit. May this book guide the earnest seeker toward clarity, responsibility, and peace. Introduction. Why wars exist. The spiritual core of all conflict. Humanity today looks at war from the outside. It sees explosions, weapons, soldiers, treaties, invasions, victories, and losses. But these are only the surface waves of a much deeper current. Like the visible tip of an iceberg, the earthly battlefield is merely the last stage of a long spiritual process that begins in the invisible. The Grail message explains that every earthly happening must first exist in the spiritual realm, for the spiritual is the origin of all form and movement in creation. Thus, wars do not originate from generals, politics, or armies. They begin long before, in the inner life of individuals and nations. War is the materialization of accumulated wrong volitions. Wherever hatred is nourished, envy is tolerated, selfishness is cultivated, dishonesty is justified, ambition is glorified, fear is allowed to dominate, and spiritual indifference is widespread, there the seed of war is sown. Modern humanity has become an incubator for such destructive thoughts and volitions. People nurture hostility in their hearts, feed conflict through their speech, and poison the spiritual atmosphere with dark emotions. These form living structures, thought forms, which attract similar energies, cluster into power fields, and eventually seek earthly expression. When these accumulated forces gather around nations or groups with similar inner states, the pressure becomes so great that war is inevitable unless the people change their inner attitude. Thus, the core truth is this. Wars exist because humanity continually produces the spiritual conditions that give birth to them. No political peace can last without inner peace. No treaty can survive hatred. No constitution can prevent the harvest of wrong sowing. The aim of this book is to expose these spiritual mechanisms so humanity might finally understand why peace on earth has proven so difficult, and how it can yet become possible. Part 1. What war really is. Understanding war is a spiritual event before it becomes an earthly one. Chapter 1. War begins in the spirit, not on the battlefield. To understand war, we must lift our gaze beyond the earthly scene. The Grail message teaches that everything earthly is the final, densest expression of processes that begin in the spiritual realm, where thoughts, volitions, and emotions take form long before they manifest physically. War is no exception. Before a soldier takes up a weapon, a leader gives an order, or a nation mobilizes, the forces that bring war into existence have already long been active. War begins when A nation cultivates pride and superiority. Communities nourish hatred or suspicion. Individuals harbor resentment or vengeful thoughts. Selfish ambition becomes a collective norm. Moral decay spreads through society. Spiritual indifference disconnects people from the laws of creation. These inner attitudes generate spiritual pressures. The laws of creation, perfect, just, incorruptible, ensure that these pressures must eventually seek an outlet, just as steam must escape a sealed vessel. War is that outlet. It is the bursting forth of accumulated spiritual darkness that humanity itself has produced. Thus, armies do not create war, they express it. Leaders do not initiate war, they merely give earthly voice to forces already present. Nations do not decide to fight, they are driven by the spiritual consequences of years, often generations, of wrong volition. This does not excuse earthly leaders or participants. They are fully responsible for their choices. But those choices themselves are only possible because the spiritual atmosphere surrounding them is already poisoned by humanity's collective volition. If the spirit of a nation is filled with goodwill, peace, honesty, humility, justice, and a striving toward the light, war becomes spiritually impossible. There is simply no soil within which it can germinate. Thus the first truth is, war is not born on earth. It descends into earthly expression only after humans have spiritually sown the seeds of conflict. And in this truth lies humanity's only hope. If man changes inwardly, war can never arise outwardly. Chapter 2. The thought forms that create wars. Thoughts are not mere ideas. They are living shapes, formed from the spiritual substance of creation, vibrating, attracting, repelling, strengthening, or weakening according to their nature. Every human thought takes form, lives, acts, influences, and returns to its origin. When humanity harbors millions of thoughts of fear, hatred, revenge, pride, greed, and ambition, these do not disappear. They accumulate into massive clouds of dark thought forms that hover above nations, groups, and individuals. These thought forms attract similar thoughts, weave themselves into collective patterns, amplify hostility, connect people of similar inner states, and exert pressure on earthly events. Wars arise when these thought forms have grown so dense, so powerful, and so charged with destructive volition that the spiritual atmosphere around a people becomes combustible. At that point, even a small earthly incident, a political disagreement, a border dispute, an economic strain, or a provocation, can ignite a firestorm. It is not the incident that creates the war. It is the thought forms that have accumulated. Just as a dry forest can be ignited by a small spark, so spiritually dark nations can be thrown into war by trivial events. This understanding reveals why peace treaties fail, diplomatic agreements shatter, international institutions collapse. Never again becomes again and again. You cannot prevent forest fires by rearranging the trees. You prevent them by removing the dryness. Humanity tries to prevent war by signing papers, negotiating deals, or building institutions, yet does nothing to cleanse its thoughts. Thus peace remains fragile. No agreement can withstand the storm of humanity's inner corruption. The Grail Message teaches: change the spiritual atmosphere, and war evaporates. Leave the inner life unchanged, and war returns. Thought forms are the true architects of conflict. Until mankind learns to govern its thoughts, it will remain helpless before the wars it creates. Chapter 3. Tools of Darkness: How Inner Corruption Invites Outer Violence. Every act of violence in the outer world has its roots in the inner realm. Human beings, by virtue of free will, may choose to cultivate light, or to embrace darkness. Darkness within does not remain inert, it seeks expression, and it finds tools in the material world. These tools, armies, weapons, ideologies, media, and organized structures, are mere extensions of inner corruption. A mind filled with pride, envy, and selfish ambition naturally looks for means to enforce its will. A society saturated with dishonesty, manipulation, and moral compromise builds structures that enable control, coercion, and war. The weaponry, tactics, and strategies of battle are simply manifestations of the inner state. The Grail Message emphasizes, spiritual corruption always seeks an outlet. Inner hatred crystallizes into outer violence. A nation that tolerates moral decay or suppresses the development of conscience will inevitably produce leaders and systems that act as instruments of conflict. The responsibility lies first within the individual. Each human who allows anger, resentment, fear, or prejudice to dominate their spirit contributes to the spiritual climate that invites war. Collective darkness forms, and as it solidifies, earthly tools of destruction emerge naturally, not by accident. In short, the battlefield is a mirror. The instruments of war are reflections of inner conditions. As long as humanity remains unaware of its inner state, it will continue to create new means of destruction, even more ingenious and devastating than before. The path to ending war is therefore internal. Purification of thought, word, and will, which dismantles the spiritual scaffolding that gives rise to outer violence. Chapter 4. Collective Guilt. Why Nations Attract the Leaders They Deserve. History demonstrates a recurring truth. Nations often rise and fall according to the collective moral and spiritual state of their people. A nation cannot sustain integrity if its citizens ignore conscience, cultivate self-interest, or nurture cruelty. The Grail Message teaches that leadership is not chosen arbitrarily. Nations attract the leaders who reflect their inner qualities, their collective conscience or its absence. A nation that tolerates dishonesty, corruption, or injustice at the personal level will find leaders who embody and magnify these traits. Similarly, nations steeped in fear, prejudice, and hatred will attract leaders who act on those same impulses, often leading to conflict. Leaders are the visible expression of collective thought and will. They do not act independently of the spiritual currents that have formed around them. This principle applies equally to groups, organizations, and societies. When a population refuses responsibility, nurtures resentment, or seeks power for selfish ends, it inevitably attracts authority figures who fulfill these inclinations, sometimes to the point of national or global catastrophe. Understanding collective guilt is not a call to despair. It is a call to awakening. When individuals within a society awaken, purify their intentions, and act in alignment with truth, the spiritual atmosphere shifts. The nation can then attract leaders who serve justice, peace, and order, rather than chaos and destruction. The lesson is clear. The responsibility for war does not rest solely on rulers or generals. It rests primarily on the inner state of the collective. Nations fight the wars they spiritually prepare for long before armies march. Part 2. The True Causes of War. Exposing the Seeds That Grow into Conflict. Chapter 5. Hatred and Envy, the First Sparks. War is born from the first sparks of spiritual darkness, hatred and envy. These forces, when nurtured in the human heart, grow silently but relentlessly, often unnoticed. Hatred arises when one allows resentment, bitterness, or wounded pride to dominate the spirit. Envy emerges when one compares oneself to others, desiring what another possesses. Left unchecked, these emotions transform the inner world into a battlefield. The Grail Message reveals that hatred and envy are not mere feelings, they are active forces of spiritual energy. They shape thought forms that can spread invisibly, influencing communities, families, and nations. Where these energies accumulate, they seek release, often manifesting as conflict or war. Importantly, the first sparks of hatred rarely start as a desire to destroy life itself. They begin as self-interest, intolerance, or unexamined bias. However, if allowed to grow, they form a spiritual climate in which violence becomes almost inevitable. Humanity must therefore recognize hatred and envy as the earliest warning signs. Inner vigilance, self-awareness, and the practice of forgiveness are necessary to prevent these sparks from igniting the flames of war. Chapter 6. Greed, Power, and the Will to Dominate. Hatred and envy, if combined with greed and ambition, become a furnace for global conflict. Greed is the desire to take more than one needs, to possess beyond necessity. Power, in its corrupt form, is the urge to control, dominate, and impose one's will over others. When these impulses are widespread, nations and leaders become instruments of conflict. The Grail Message teaches that the desire to dominate arises from spiritual disconnection. It is the misuse of free will, turning one's abilities toward self-aggrandizement rather than service. Greed and domination are the fertilizers for war. They distort justice, encourage exploitation, and blind people to conscience. Societies that celebrate wealth, status, and control above inner truth and collective well-being inevitably produce wars of conquest, oppression, and exploitation. The message is stern yet hopeful. Recognizing the roots of greed and domination within oneself and society is the first step toward preventing the wars they produce. When individuals reject these impulses and align with the laws of creation, they become conduits of peace and spiritual stability. Chapter 7. Lies, Deceit, and the Collapse of Trust. The seed of war often begins with a single betrayal. Lies, deceit, and half-truths erode the foundation of trust that binds individuals, communities, and nations. The Grail Message teaches that every act of deception creates a fracture in the spiritual fabric of humanity, a subtle weakening of harmony that invites conflict. When trust collapses, fear and suspicion grow to fill the vacuum. People begin to see others as enemies or competitors rather than partners in a shared journey of creation. Deceit, whether personal, political, or societal, sows confusion, and confusion grows into chaos. Wars are rarely spontaneous. They are often the fruit of long-standing patterns of dishonesty, where small untruths accumulate into institutionalized corruption and manipulation. A society that tolerates lies in its commerce, politics, or interpersonal relations is spiritually vulnerable. It attracts the conditions for conflict. True prevention begins within the individual. Honesty, transparency, and integrity are not merely ethical virtues, they are spiritual shields. By nurturing these qualities, humanity strengthens the inner connections that resist the spread of hatred, resentment, and ultimately, war. Chapter 8. Injustice, the most dangerous fuel of war. Injustice is the tinder that lights the fire of human conflict. Where one group feels wronged, deprived, or oppressed, inner resistance and resentment grow. The Grail Message clarifies that injustice is not only a social or political matter, it is a spiritual disturbance. When justice is denied, the spirit recoils. Anger, hatred, and the desire for retribution awaken. If left unchecked, these forces accumulate and eventually seek release on a collective scale. Wars, revolutions, and rebellions often arise from this inner need to correct imbalances and restore harmony, but the means are frequently destructive when guided by wounded pride rather than spiritual truth. A society or individual that ignores justice also ignores the law of spiritual balance. Creation requires equilibrium, and when injustice prevails, imbalance manifests in all realms, mentally, socially, and spiritually. Nations and leaders who perpetuate inequity unwittingly feed the energy of war. The path to peace requires the courage to act in accordance with justice. It begins in personal relationships, extends to communities, and ultimately forms the moral atmosphere of nations. Justice is not merely legal, it is spiritual alignment with the laws of creation, the only force capable of preventing the descent into conflict. Chapter 9. The Role of Fear and Cowardice. Fear is one of the most subtle and insidious forces in the genesis of war. When individuals or nations act out of fear, fear of loss, fear of change, fear of the unknown, they often make decisions that escalate conflict rather than resolve it. Cowardice, too, plays its part. Avoiding responsibility, turning a blind eye to corruption or aggression, and failing to confront injustice embolden those who seek domination. The Grail Message teaches that fear clouds the spirit's judgment, limiting the perception of truth and distorting priorities. Wars often arise not because people actively desire conflict, but because they fail to act rightly when confronted with injustice, lies, or aggression. Fear paralyzes moral courage, allowing destructive forces to gain momentum. Overcoming fear and cowardice is a spiritual task. It requires inner strengthening, alignment with divine principles, and the cultivation of courage grounded in truth rather than ego. Only through the mastery of fear can humanity prevent the ignition of wars born from hesitation, misunderstanding, or avoidance of moral responsibility. Part 3. How War is Formed in the Beyond. The Spiritual Mechanics Behind Earthly Conflicts. Chapter 10. Dark Aggregations, How Human Thoughts Gather Power. Before any battle is fought on the physical plane, the war has already begun in the spiritual realm. The Grail Message reveals that thoughts, intentions, and unresolved emotions are spiritual forces. When hatred, envy, or desire for domination is collectively nurtured, these forces gather into what can be called dark aggregations, clusters of energy that amplify the potential for conflict. These aggregations are not myth, they are real spiritual phenomena. They feed on repeated patterns of negative thinking, shared resentment, and the emotional charge of fear and anger. The stronger the intensity of these energies, the more they influence both individuals and societies, creating an almost inevitable momentum toward physical war. Every decision to indulge in hatred, every act of injustice, every compromise of conscience strengthens these aggregations. They become invisible but potent influencers, subtly guiding leaders and populations toward aggression, exploitation, or domination. The antidote lies in conscious cultivation of light, forgiveness, understanding, and alignment with truth. When enough individuals refuse to feed darkness, these aggregations lose coherence, and the spiritual conditions for war are weakened. This principle demonstrates that prevention begins within, not in treaties or negotiations alone. Humanity's collective thoughts, when purified, can dismantle the unseen forces that otherwise bring war to Earth. Chapter 11. The Birth of Collective Darkness. Before a nation picks up weapons or before a battle erupts, the darkness has already been born in the collective human consciousness. The Grail Message teaches that the energies of hatred, greed, and envy, when shared and multiplied among groups of people, form a collective darkness, a spiritual entity fueled by the combined strength of negative thoughts and emotions. This darkness is not abstract, it has influence. It shapes perceptions, encourages fear, fuels suspicion, and predisposes humanity toward aggression. It is neither sentient in the human sense nor inherently evil by intention, but it is a distortion of the spiritual order, a shadow that gathers wherever mankind turns away from truth. Collective darkness often begins subtly. Murmurs of injustice, whispered fears, exaggerations of threat. If uncorrected, these energies attract like-minded spirits and intensify, eventually reaching a tipping point where the energy itself demands release. The key to countering collective darkness is vigilance in thought and deed. Individual integrity, compassion, and commitment to truth weaken the formation of this darkness. Spiritual light is not a vague ideal, it is a real force that disperses the energy of potential conflict, preventing the birth of war before it reaches the earthly plane. Chapter 12. The Threshold of Outbreak, When the Darkness Overflows. Once the collective darkness reaches sufficient intensity, it approaches a threshold. At this point, the spiritual pressure seeks release, often manifesting as conflict on earth. The Grail Message clarifies that no war is purely accidental, it is always the overflow of spiritual imbalance into the material world. This threshold is marked by heightened fear, distrust, and moral confusion within societies. Leaders act rashly, populations are swayed by rhetoric, and the seeds of aggression find fertile ground. The spiritual imbalance amplifies ordinary disagreements, inflating them into crises that escalate beyond control. Humanity often fails to perceive this threshold because the darkness operates invisibly, influencing minds and emotions before any physical violence occurs. Recognition of the signs, a surge of hatred, increasing intolerance, obsession with power, is critical. Spiritual awareness and alignment with divine principles act as barriers that prevent the overflow, keeping the energy contained and dissipating it harmlessly before it manifests as war. Chapter 13. Why war often appears suddenly. Wars may appear sudden to the observer, but their origins are long in formation. The Grail Message explains that the spiritual mechanics of conflict operate on a level unseen by most. Years, even decades, of unresolved fear, hatred, greed, and injustice coalesce into a spiritual momentum. When the threshold of collective darkness is reached, it requires only a spark, an event, a provocation, or a miscalculation, to ignite. The apparent suddenness of war is thus the visible outcome of a slow, invisible accumulation of spiritual energies. Humanity is often unaware of the patterns that lead to war because daily life, distractions, and preoccupations obscure the spiritual realities. Recognizing that sudden wars are symptoms, not causes, empowers mankind to address the underlying conditions. Truth, justice, and inner purification act as preventive measures, reducing the likelihood of explosive outbreaks and enabling societies to resist the hidden forces that drive conflict. Part 4. The Effects of War on Earth and in the Beyond. What war does to mankind, the soul, and the world. Chapter 14. The Physical Devastation of War. War is often measured by its physical toll: cities destroyed, lives lost, resources wasted. Yet the Grail Message teaches that these effects, while real, are only the visible reflection of far deeper damage. Physical devastation mirrors spiritual devastation, the collapse of trust, the erosion of morality, and the severing of human connection. The body suffers first, but the spirit is the ultimate battlefield. War hardens hearts, dulls compassion, and reinforces cycles of revenge. Those who survive may carry fear, hatred, and unresolved pain into their remaining years, influencing families, communities, and even the spiritual environment around them. Destruction is not only external. Land, forests, rivers, and wildlife are affected, creating long-term imbalance that resonates in the spiritual world. The Grail Message reveals that every act of violence echoes beyond the visible, weakening the harmony of creation. Healing begins not with weapons or diplomacy alone, but with spiritual renewal. A society that acknowledges the unseen consequences of war, cultivates forgiveness, and rebuilds trust contributes to the restoration of both earth and spirit. Physical reconstruction is temporary without the restoration of the inner world. Chapter 15. The Spiritual Wounds of War. Beyond the physical devastation, war leaves profound spiritual scars. These wounds are invisible yet enduring, affecting individuals, families, communities, and even nations. The Grail Message teaches that every act of violence or hatred creates a disturbance in the spiritual fabric of the human soul. Spiritual wounds manifest as fear, anger, distrust, and emotional numbness. Soldiers, civilians, and leaders alike carry the unseen burden of unresolved conflict. Even those not directly involved may be influenced by the collective energies of war, absorbing fear and aggression through subtle spiritual channels. Healing requires recognition and conscious effort. It is not enough to rebuild homes or cities. Hearts must be reconciled, and the spiritual integrity of individuals restored. Forgiveness, self-reflection, and alignment with the laws of creation serve as remedies, gradually neutralizing the lingering energies of darkness that war leaves behind. Those who ignore the spiritual wounds of war risk perpetuating cycles of violence, as unhealed souls unknowingly contribute to the next surge of collective darkness. The Grail Message emphasizes that awareness, repentance, and conscious purification are the pathways to restoring inner peace and preventing spiritual decay from multiplying into future conflict. Chapter 16. The Judgment Hidden in War. Every war carries a hidden judgment, not imposed externally, but arising naturally from the law of cause and effect. The Grail Message clarifies that nothing in creation occurs outside the spiritual laws. Acts of hatred, greed, and injustice, when multiplied collectively, create circumstances that inevitably return to their source. This judgment is impartial. It does not favor the innocent or punish the guilty arbitrarily. It simply reflects the spiritual reality of actions taken. Nations and individuals who sow discord and harm others experience consequences, whether through loss, suffering, or societal collapse. Conversely, those who resist war, act justly, and cultivate light in their communities shield themselves from unnecessary suffering. Understanding this hidden judgment allows mankind to see war not merely as political or economic failure but as a reflection of spiritual imbalance. Prevention begins with self-examination, correcting inner weaknesses, choosing truth over falsehood, and cultivating harmony in thought, word, and deed. Spiritual vigilance becomes the ultimate safeguard against the judgment that accompanies war. Chapter 17. Separation through conflict. War divides more than land or resources, it divides souls. Communities that were once united splinter into distrust, animosity, and enmity. Families, friendships, and nations experience separation that often persists long after treaties are signed. The Grail Message teaches that this separation mirrors a spiritual truth. When the spirit turns away from light, isolation and fragmentation naturally follow. War, in its essence, is the material reflection of spiritual disunity. It exposes the human inability to cooperate with the laws of creation and magnifies the consequences of unresolved inner conflict. Rebuilding connection requires conscious effort, communication grounded in truth, reconciliation through empathy, and alignment with divine principles. Only by restoring the inner harmony of the spirit can external separations be healed, preventing the perpetuation of conflict across generations. Part 5. The errors that lead humanity into war. How mankind invites its own suffering. Chapter 18. Materialism, the root of modern conflict. At the heart of much contemporary war lies materialism, the overvaluation of possessions, power, and worldly status at the expense of spiritual law. The Grail Message teaches that materialism blinds humanity to the higher realities of existence, replacing love, wisdom, and justice with greed and ambition. Material desires intensify competition, provoke envy, and generate fear of loss. Societies that prioritize wealth over virtue inadvertently sow the seeds of internal and external conflict. Nations fight not only over resources but also over the illusions of supremacy, control, and entitlement, forgetting that true security and abundance are rooted in the spirit, not in worldly accumulation. The spiritual correction offered by the Grail Message is clear. Freedom from material obsession leads to inner clarity and reduces the likelihood of war. When individuals and nations recognize that spiritual law governs the cosmos and that love, justice, and service are the true measures of life, they prevent the inner conditions that give rise to collective darkness. War, therefore, is not a random occurrence, it is a symptom of human error. By correcting these errors, materialism, selfish ambition, and disregard for divine law, mankind can create societies grounded in peace, foresight, and spiritual harmony, cutting the roots of future conflict before they take hold. Chapter 19. National Pride and Group Arrogance. National pride is a double-edged sword. While love for one's homeland can inspire service and unity, excessive pride evolves into arrogance, entitlement, and the belief that one nation is superior to all others. The Grail Message teaches that this pride blinds people to the universal law of spiritual equality and interconnectedness. When nations cultivate arrogance, they foster competition, suspicion, and aggression. Borders, policies, and ideologies become weapons of control rather than instruments of justice. Leaders who inflate the honor of their country at the expense of others ignite the flames of conflict, believing that domination validates existence. Spiritual correction begins with humility, the recognition that all nations and peoples share the same origin in creation. True national pride arises not from superiority but from striving for virtue, justice, and service. A nation that honors the spiritual principles of creation fosters peace internally and externally, breaking the cycle where pride breeds war. Chapter 20. Tribalism, Prejudice, and the Spirit of Division. Division among humans, tribalism, racial prejudice, and social discrimination, is a spiritual error with long-lasting consequences. The Grail Message illuminates that all human beings are manifestations of the same divine creation. Discrimination, therefore, violates the fundamental laws of spiritual unity. Prejudice hardens hearts, creating barriers that fuel anger, fear, and suspicion. Tribalism or group favoritism fosters a false sense of superiority, encouraging manipulation and oppression. These attitudes generate energy that darkens the collective spirit, creating fertile ground for wars rooted in hatred and revenge. Correcting this error requires conscious awakening. Recognition of the shared origin of humanity, coupled with the cultivation of empathy and understanding, dissolves divisions. When individuals and groups act from love rather than prejudice, the spiritual atmosphere brightens, preventing the escalation of latent tensions into full-scale conflict. Chapter 21. The Misuse of Religion. Religion, when misapplied, becomes a powerful tool for division rather than unity. The Grail Message teaches that all true religions originate from divine truth and are intended to guide the human spirit. However, when religious teachings are distorted for power, control, or exclusion, they ignite spiritual darkness and prepare the soil for war. Dogma and ritual, when separated from the inner understanding of divine law, produce conflict between believers and non-believers alike. Leaders may claim divine sanction for their ambitions, and masses may follow blindly, believing that aggression is justified. Spiritual blindness allows these distortions to spread, leading to violence, persecution, and mass suffering. The correction lies in returning to the essence of divine law, love, justice, and service. When faith is practiced inwardly, as a guide for personal moral conduct rather than a weapon against others, religion becomes a unifying force. Education in true spiritual principles and the cultivation of personal responsibility dissolve the misuse of faith and reduce the likelihood of war. Chapter 22. Abuse of Freedom and the Corruption of Authority. Freedom is a divine gift, but without alignment with spiritual law, it can become destructive. The Grail Message warns that freedom without responsibility corrupts both individuals and societies. Leaders may exploit liberties for personal gain, while citizens may act selfishly, disregarding consequences for others. Corruption of authority compounds the problem. Those in power who forsake justice and virtue create systems that generate oppression, inequality, and resentment. Such conditions inevitably provoke conflict, both within nations and between them. War, in this sense, is not merely a political failure, it is the natural outcome of disobedience to spiritual law. The remedy requires conscious use of freedom, aligning personal choices with the principles of love, justice, and truth. Authorities must serve rather than dominate, and citizens must cultivate self-discipline and ethical behavior. Only when freedom is exercised in harmony with divine law does it become a safeguard against war, rather than a catalyst for suffering. Part 6. The Purpose of War in the Laws of Creation. Understanding the painful clarity that war brings. Chapter 23. War is a harvest of human will. War is not an arbitrary or random event. In the laws of creation, every conflict on earth is a reflection of the spiritual state of humanity. The Grail Message teaches that thoughts, intentions, and actions accumulate in the spiritual realm, forming the seeds that later manifest as events in the physical world. When nations or groups sow greed, hatred, pride, and injustice, they unknowingly plant the seeds of conflict. War, then, is the inevitable harvest of these accumulated intentions. It is a law of cause and effect. The energy we create through our will returns to us, either as constructive opportunity or destructive confrontation. The spiritual correction is clear: awareness of the consequences of thought and action. Nations and individuals alike must recognize that war is a mirror of inner imbalance. By cultivating inner harmony, justice, and love, humanity can prevent the painful harvest that war represents. Chapter 24. Purification through conflict. Although war brings immense suffering, the Grail Message clarifies that it also serves a higher purpose: purification. Just as fire purifies metal by removing impurities, conflict exposes the corruption, injustice, and arrogance that have festered unnoticed. Through the experience of war, both individuals and societies confront the results of their spiritual neglect. They are compelled to reflect on ethical failures, reevaluate priorities, and, if awakened, seek reconciliation. War acts as a wake-up call to the collective consciousness, showing humanity where correction is required. The key lies in response. Those who recognize the divine lesson in conflict can purify their hearts and minds, transforming the tragedy into spiritual growth. Ignorance or stubbornness, however, deepens darkness and prolongs suffering. Chapter 25. The Breaking of Arrogance. Arrogance, whether personal or collective, is one of the primary triggers of war. Nations, leaders, and groups that refuse to acknowledge spiritual and moral limits eventually face situations that humble them. The Grail Message explains that such trials are designed not for punishment, but for awakening. Conflict strips away illusions of superiority. It forces recognition of limitations, mortality, and interconnectedness. Through the breaking of arrogance, the spirit is offered the opportunity to realign with truth and justice. Those who resist this lesson may experience prolonged hardship, while those who embrace it can emerge with heightened awareness, humility, and readiness for service. Understanding this principle transforms the fear of war into insight. Every struggle contains the potential for moral and spiritual rectification. Chapter 26. War as Mirror. War is a mirror reflecting the collective state of the human spirit. Just as the surface of water reveals what lies beneath, conflict exposes the hidden darkness of selfishness, greed, and spiritual neglect. It is a warning. The outer world manifests the inner world, and the only way to prevent destruction is to transform the inner self. The Grail Message emphasizes that humanity must not only address the visible consequences of war, political upheaval, suffering, and destruction, but also confront the spiritual roots within each individual. Peace is not achieved solely through treaties or diplomacy. It is the product of collective inner awakening, ethical conduct, and alignment with the divine laws of creation. War, therefore, is both a tragedy and a teacher. It illuminates where correction is necessary, urging humanity to see the truth of its own actions, to heal the spiritual wounds that gave rise to it, and to cultivate virtues that prevent future conflict. Part 7. The Path Out of War. How Mankind Can Escape the Cycle of Conflict. Chapter 27. Inner Transformation, the Only True Peace Treaty. Peace cannot be decreed by treaties alone, nor enforced by armies or laws. The Grail Message teaches that true peace begins within the individual spirit. Every external conflict mirrors an inner disharmony, anger, hatred, pride, or envy, that has gone uncorrected. Inner transformation requires honest self-examination. The seeker must confront the motives behind every thought and action. Is the heart ruled by selfishness or openness? Does the mind nurture judgment or understanding? By aligning personal will with divine law, the spirit cultivates calmness, patience, and love, which radiate outward to influence society. Only when individuals commit to this inner work can nations begin to mirror that peace. The outer world is a reflection. The inner treaty of the spirit is the only one that endures. Chapter 28. Justice, the Foundation of Lasting Peace. Justice is the cornerstone of both spiritual and societal harmony. The Grail Message clarifies that when human actions violate natural and divine law, imbalance arises, eventually manifesting as conflict. Nations, groups, or individuals that act unjustly invite resistance, rebellion, and war. Justice is not mere law enforcement or fairness in worldly matters. It is alignment with the spiritual order, ensuring that every action respects the rights and dignity of others. It requires honesty, accountability, and a willingness to correct wrongs. A society built upon this understanding of justice prevents the spiritual ferment that fuels conflict. Justice must be cultivated individually and collectively. Without it, peace remains fragile, vulnerable to the first stirrings of human pride or greed. Chapter 29. Truthfulness in Thought, Word, and Deed. Falsehood is the root of all conflict. Lies, half-truths, and concealments distort reality, breed mistrust, and allow misunderstandings to fester into violence. The Grail Message teaches that truthfulness, consistent in thought, word, and deed, is a shield against the darkness that leads to war. Truthfulness does not simply mean avoiding lies, it means cultivating integrity, transparency, and sincerity in every interaction. It ensures that intentions are clear, agreements are honored, and relationships are based on trust rather than manipulation. Communities that embrace truthfulness create a spiritual environment in which conflict cannot easily take root. Inner truth fosters outer peace. Deception inevitably begets suffering. Chapter 30. Purification of Nations and Individuals. To end the cycle of war, purification must occur at both the personal and collective levels. The Grail Message emphasizes that negative tendencies, greed, pride, hatred, and envy, must be cleansed through inner work, repentance, and alignment with divine law. For individuals, this involves daily self-discipline, reflection, and striving for moral and spiritual excellence. For nations, it requires leadership that values justice, transparency, and service over power, as well as cultural renewal that fosters empathy, unity, and the recognition of shared humanity. Purification strengthens the spirit, harmonizes communities, and creates conditions in which peace naturally arises. It is the light that dispels the darkness from which war is born. Chapter 31. The Necessity of Spiritual Maturity. Wars do not merely emerge from politics or economics, they are the outward expression of inner immaturity. The Grail Message emphasizes that humanity's collective spiritual immaturity is the soil in which conflict grows. A mature spirit understands the laws of creation, acts with self-restraint, and perceives the consequences of actions beyond the immediate moment. Spiritual maturity requires responsibility, self-discipline, and the awakening of conscience. The immature spirit reacts impulsively to anger, envy, or fear, perpetuating cycles of misunderstanding and aggression. In contrast, the mature spirit exercises discernment, patience, and foresight, thereby interrupting the chain of reaction that leads to war. Maturity also entails recognizing the interconnectedness of all people. When humanity understands that harming others ultimately harms oneself, and that peace is a reflection of inner order, conflict loses its power to dominate. Nations, communities, and individuals who cultivate spiritual maturity become anchors of peace, preventing the escalation of tension into open warfare. Part 8. The Last Hour. Wars in the Final Judgment. The meaning of increasing conflicts in the present time. Chapter 32. The Great Global Tension. The Grail Message clarifies that the current surge of global conflicts is not random. It is a reflection of accumulated human choices, moral failures, and the imbalance between spirit and materialism. Tensions arise as the natural consequence of uncorrected injustice, arrogance, and neglect of spiritual laws. This great global tension serves as a warning. It is not punishment from God but a mirror that shows the consequences of collective misalignment with divine order. Nations and leaders act as vessels of accumulated spiritual energy. Those attuned to wisdom foster cooperation, while those driven by greed and pride amplify discord. Recognizing this tension as a spiritual phenomenon, rather than a purely political one, allows humanity to respond with insight. Efforts toward reconciliation, justice, and inner transformation are the only measures that can prevent escalation. Chapter 33. The Collapse of False Powers and Corrupt Nations. History demonstrates a spiritual principle. When corruption, greed, and exploitation dominate a nation, its foundations become unstable. The Grail Message explains that such powers are ultimately ephemeral, for the laws of creation cannot sustain structures built on disobedience to truth and justice. False powers collapse because their authority lacks moral and spiritual substance. Wars and revolutions often signal the breaking point, where collective will refuses to sustain injustice any longer. These upheavals serve as a spiritual cleansing, creating the space for new order and alignment with the laws of creation. For individuals and nations, understanding this principle reduces fear. Collapse is not the end, but a call to reorient towards truth, justice, and cooperation, and to embrace inner purification as the path to lasting security. Chapter 34. War is Final Warning. In the Grail understanding, war is a warning, not a sentence. Increasing conflicts in the present time are the last opportunity for humanity to recognize the consequences of deviation from spiritual law. If mankind heeds the warning, there is the possibility of correction. If ignored, the consequences deepen, leading toward destruction and final separation from spiritual light. Every conflict, whether small or large, carries lessons: the danger of pride, the cost of injustice, the futility of greed, and the necessity of spiritual alignment. The final warning is both external and internal, visible in nations, but equally present in the choices of every individual. Those who awaken, correct, and purify themselves become beacons of hope. They model peace, radiate understanding, and help to prevent the descent into chaos. War, in this sense, serves as a spiritual clarifier. It exposes weaknesses, illuminates error, and points humanity toward the path of awakening before it is too late. Chapter 35. The Separation of Light and Darkness. The Grail Message illuminates that the final period of global conflict is a spiritual reckoning, a time when the forces of light and darkness, long interwoven in human affairs, begin to separate clearly. This separation is not merely physical or political, it is the crystallization of spiritual alignment or misalignment. Those who have cultivated inner light, justice, and compassion will naturally gravitate toward cooperation, understanding, and peaceful resolution. Conversely, those who persist in pride, greed, and oppression amplify chaos and violence. This divergence is unavoidable because spiritual laws cannot be suspended. The energy of darkness and the energy of light cannot coexist indefinitely in harmony. The separation is merciful in essence. It allows the awakened spirit to act decisively, to protect life, and to guide others toward transformation. For those yet caught in the currents of darkness, it is a warning. The opportunity for realignment is still present, but it demands recognition, repentance, and courage. Part 9. The Coming Peace, After the Purification. What awaits humanity after the storm? Chapter 36. The New Earthly Order. After the storms of conflict have subsided, the Grail Message reveals, a new earthly order emerges, founded upon the principles of truth, justice, and spiritual alignment. This is not merely political or economic restructuring, it is the creation of a society that reflects the laws of creation, where inner light determines action, and where governance arises from moral and spiritual strength rather than fear or manipulation. In this new order, the destructive cycles of war are replaced by cooperation and foresight. Nations learn from past mistakes, establishing systems that prioritize human dignity, environmental balance, and social equity. The external world mirrors the internal transformation of individuals. Peace begins as a reflection of personal alignment with spiritual laws. This new order is characterized by stability, but not stagnation. It thrives on conscious creativity, responsibility, and collective vigilance. Humanity learns that lasting peace is not a gift, but a consequence of persistent adherence to truth and the cultivation of inner light. Chapter 37. The New Humanity of the Light. The Grail Message emphasizes that the true agents of post-conflict reconstruction are individuals whose spirits have awakened. The new humanity of the light is composed of those who have chosen justice over tyranny, service over selfishness, and spiritual maturity over impulsive desire. This humanity is not defined by ethnicity, nationality, or ideology but by alignment with divine principles. Its members naturally collaborate, their vision unified by the recognition that all life is interconnected and sacred. They radiate peace, compassion, and wisdom, inspiring others to awaken and build a society founded on higher principles. Here, human potential is fully realized. Knowledge is tempered with responsibility, strength with compassion, and freedom with order. War has been the crucible, purging the misaligned forces, and leaving behind a population capable of sustaining lasting peace. Chapter 38. Purified Nations and Leadership of the Spiritually Awakened. The Grail Message makes clear that leadership in the new era is no longer about power, wealth, or influence. It is about service, wisdom, and spiritual awareness. Nations led by awakened individuals embody integrity, fairness, and foresight. Their policies honor life, encourage growth, and uphold the spiritual laws that govern creation. Purification at the national level is the extension of individual awakening. As leaders align with the light, corruption, exploitation, and aggression fade. Societies flourish not merely materially, but spiritually. Citizens are inspired to act responsibly, uphold justice, and cultivate inner light. This chapter emphasizes that the new global peace is not passive, it requires conscious effort, vigilance, and collective dedication. Yet, with adherence to divine laws and the wisdom gained from prior conflicts, humanity finally experiences a period of harmony where wars no longer dominate the consciousness of nations or individuals. Chapter 39. The End of War Forever. The Grail Message illuminates that the end of war is not a distant fantasy, it is a natural consequence of spiritual awakening. When humanity collectively aligns with the laws of creation, the conditions that give rise to conflict cease to exist. War, at its root, is the manifestation of imbalance within the human spirit: hatred, fear, greed, and the desire to dominate. Remove these, and the external wars dissolve. The end of war does not come through treaties or agreements alone, it arises from the transformation of consciousness. Individuals, communities, and nations learn to govern themselves according to truth and justice. Leadership is guided by moral responsibility rather than ambition. Disputes are resolved through dialogue, empathy, and mutual recognition of human dignity. This final peace is enduring because it is not imposed, it flows naturally from the awakened state of humanity. The Grail Message emphasizes that the eradication of war is both an inner and outer phenomenon. As inner light grows, fear diminishes; as fear diminishes, the justification for violence vanishes. The world becomes a mirror of the purified spirit of its inhabitants. Conclusion. War is the shadow of the human will. The Grail Message teaches that all war is the shadow cast by the human will when it deviates from divine order. When humanity acts in opposition to the laws of creation, seeking power, vengeance, or selfish gain, the result is conflict, suffering, and destruction. War is never arbitrary, it is the direct reflection of human choices, magnified across collective consciousness. Conversely, when humanity chooses alignment with truth, justice, and love, war becomes impossible. The shadow disappears, and the light of the awakened spirit guides all actions. This conclusion serves as both a warning and an invitation. Every individual is called to examine the motives of their heart and the state of their will. In doing so, they participate directly in the creation of lasting peace. The responsibility is profound, yet hopeful. Each act of honesty, fairness, and compassion diminishes the shadow. Each decision to act in the light reinforces the potential for a world where war is no longer a reality. Epilogue. To the one who seeks peace. To the seeker of peace, the Grail Message speaks clearly. Peace is not found in negotiation alone, nor in external institutions. True peace originates in the spirit. It requires courage, discipline, and unwavering alignment with the laws of creation. The epilogue invites humanity to awaken to the eternal truth. The light within each individual is the foundation of all external harmony. By cultivating justice, compassion, and spiritual maturity, humanity can bring about a world in which war is a memory, not a reality. The call is personal yet universal. Every heart that chooses the light contributes to the collective awakening. Each act of understanding and service strengthens the web of peace, until a global order emerges where conflict is no longer conceivable. The Grail Message thus illuminates the path. Seek the light, nurture the spirit, and the world itself will reflect eternal peace. Appendix. Spiritual practices for peace. Meditation on light, daily self-reflection, forgiveness exercises, and service to others. Principles of justice and governance. Aligning personal and national decisions with truth, fairness, and moral responsibility. Recognition of inner conflict. Understanding how unresolved anger, pride, and fear can manifest as collective conflict. Guidelines for conflict resolution. Active listening, empathy, transparent communication, and spiritual alignment is the basis for problem solving. Case studies. Historical and contemporary examples of how inner alignment leads to peace, and how deviation from divine principles led to conflict. The appendix serves as a practical guide for applying the principles outlined in the book, Turning Understanding into Conscious Action.